The dust hung thick in the stifling summer air as Hannah Rollins stood on the auction platform, her wrists bound together with coarse rope that chafed her delicate skin. Montana Territory, 1876, a land of opportunity for many, but for Hannah, it had become a prison. Her father's debts had finally come due, and with no means to pay them after his passing, the 22-year-old found herself being sold to the highest bidder to settle what was owed. She held her chin high, refusing to let the gathered crowd see her fear, though her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. "Next up, gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice boomed across the town square of Calistoga, Montana Territory. "This fine young woman, healthy, educated, can read and write, cook and clean. Starting bid is $50 to cover the late Mr. Rollins' outstanding debts." Hannah scanned the crowd, bile rising in her throat as she saw the hungry looks from the men gathered around the platform. Some were miners with gold dust sprinkled in their beards. Others were businessmen in pressed suits, their eyes calculating as they assessed her worth. She felt like livestock being appraised. $50, called out a voice from the back. Hannah recognized the man Bartholomew Jenkins, owner of the local saloon known for employing soiled doves, as he euphemistically called them. "60, countered another voice, belonging to an older rancher whose reputation for cruelty preceded him. The bidding continued, each increase causing Hannah's stomach to knot tighter. She had known this day was coming, since the banker had foreclosed on their small homestead 3 weeks after her father's funeral. But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of standing here, her very freedom being bartered away. 120, shouted a red-faced man with tobacco-stained teeth. 150, called Jenkins, a smirk spreading across his face. Hannah closed her eyes briefly, unable to watch as her fate was decided. When she opened them again, her gaze fell upon a man she hadn't noticed before. He stood apart from the crowd, tall and broad-shouldered, the brim of his hat pulled low over his face. There was something in his stance that seemed different from the others, less predatory, more watchful. $200, called a new voice, deep and steady. The tall stranger had raised his hand. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The debt was only $180. The stranger had deliberately overbid. 200 going once. The auctioneer called, looking around expectantly. 220, Jenkins countered, his expression darkening. 300, the stranger replied without hesitation. Jenkins scowled but shook his head. The price had climbed too high for someone he only wanted to put to work in his establishment. 300 going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. Hannah felt a wave of relief that she wouldn't be going with Jenkins, followed immediately by dread about who had purchased her instead. The tall stranger approached the platform, his spurs jingling with each step. As he drew closer, she could see his face more clearly, weather-beaten but handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard. He couldn't have been more than 30. The auctioneer handed him the rope bound to Hannah's wrists. "She's all yours, mister." "What name should I put on the bill of sale?" "Holt. Henry Holt," the stranger replied, his eyes never leaving Hannah's face. The transaction completed, Henry led Hannah away from the auction platform. She stumbled slightly, her legs weak from standing for hours in the heat. "Where are you taking me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry stopped and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. Hannah's breath caught, but instead of threatening her, he cut the rope binding her wrists. "You," he whispered, so softly she almost didn't hear him. Hannah stared at him in confusion. "I don't understand." 3 years ago, your father saved my life when my horse threw me near your homestead," Henry explained, his voice low. "He took me in, nursed me back to health, and refused payment. Said all he wanted was for me to pass on the kindness someday." He glanced back at the auction platform. "I reckon this is that someday. You're letting me go?" Hannah asked incredulously, rubbing her chafed wrists. "Not exactly," Henry replied. These parts ain't safe for a woman alone. I've got a small ranch about a day's ride from here. I'm offering you a position as my housekeeper. Fair wages, your own quarters, and my word that you'll be treated with respect." Hannah studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "I don't have much choice, do I?" "You always have a choice, Miss Rawlins," Henry said firmly. "But I hope you'll choose to trust me." As they walked toward the livery where Henry had stabled his horse, Hannah felt the stares of the townspeople following them. Her life had changed irrevocably in the span of an afternoon, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt a flicker of hope. Henry's gelding was a magnificent animal, 17 hands of solid muscle with an intelligent gleam in its dark eyes. Henry helped Hannah mount before swinging up behind her, his chest pressed against her back as he reached around to take the reins. "Hold tight," he instructed, and Hannah reluctantly gripped the saddle horn, acutely aware of his proximity. They rode out of Calistoga as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the vast Montana sky in shades of orange and pink. Hannah remained silent, lost in thought, trying to process everything that had happened. "Your father was a good man," Henry said after a while, breaking the silence. "He spoke of you often during the week I stayed with him, said you were the smartest person in the territory." Hannah felt a lump form in her throat. "He was prone to exaggeration where I was concerned." "Somehow I doubt that," Henry replied. "He showed me a sketch you'd made of the mountain range, said you'd never even had proper drawing lessons." "Art was a luxury we couldn't afford," Hannah said softly, "but Papa always managed to find scraps of paper for me." They continued riding as dusk settled around them, the cooling air a relief after the heat of the day. Eventually, Henry guided his horse off the main trail toward a copse of trees near a small stream. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced, dismounting and helping Hannah down. "We'll reach my place by midday tomorrow." Hannah stood awkwardly while Henry efficiently set up camp, unsaddling his horse and gathering firewood. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to life in the wilderness. "Are you hungry?" he asked, pulling some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. Hannah nodded, suddenly aware of the emptiness in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since early morning, too nervous about the auction to manage more than a few bites of bread. They ate in silence, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows across their faces. Hannah studied Henry surreptitiously, trying to gauge what kind of man had paid $300 to fulfill a debt of gratitude to her father. "You can ask your questions, Miss Rawlins," Henry said, startling her. "I can practically hear you thinking." Hannah hesitated, then decided directness was her best approach. "Why did you really buy me, Mr. Holt?" Henry's expression grew serious. "I told you your father saved my life." "And that's worth $300. A life is worth more than any amount of money," Henry replied simply. "Besides, I couldn't stand by and watch you go to Jenkins or any of those other vultures." "So it was pity," Hannah said flatly. "No, Miss Rawlins, it was decency." Henry's eyes reflected the firelight, something that seems in short supply these days. Hannah fell silent, mulling over his words. After a moment she asked, "What will happen when we reach your ranch? Like I said, you'll work as my housekeeper." "I've been managing on my own, but the place could use a woman's touch." He paused, then added firmly, "You'll have your own quarters, no one will bother you, and if I want to leave, then I'll pay you what you've earned and wish you well." Henry met her gaze steadily. "But I hope you'll stay." "At least until you figure out where you want to go next." Hannah nodded, satisfied with his answer for now. "Thank you, Mr. Holt." "Henry," he corrected. "If we're going to be sharing a roof, you might as well use my given name." "Then you should call me Hannah," she replied. A ghost of a smile crossed Henry's face. "Hannah, then." He stood and stretched. "You should get some rest. I'll take first watch." "Watch? Are you expecting trouble?" "Not expecting it, but always prepared for it." Henry patted the revolver at his hip. "This territory hasn't been fully tamed yet." Hannah settled onto the bedroll Henry had laid out for her, pulling the blanket up to her chin despite the lingering warmth of the summer night. As exhaustion overtook her, Her last conscious thought was that of all the outcomes she had feared from the auction. This one was the least terrible. Perhaps even a blessing in disguise. When Hannah awoke the next morning, she found Henry already up, tending to his horse and preparing a small breakfast of coffee and the remaining hardtack. The sun had barely crested the eastern mountains, painting the sky in delicate hues of pink and gold. "Morning," Henry said when he noticed her stirring. "Sleep well." Hannah sat up, smoothing her hair as best she could. "Better than I expected to," she admitted. In truth, it had been her first night without nightmares since her father's death. After a quick breakfast and a chance to freshen up by the stream, they were back on the trail. The day promised to be another scorcher, but the early morning air still held the coolness of night. Hannah found herself relaxing slightly against Henry's solid presence as they rode. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "It's not much compared to some of the big spreads," Henry replied. 160 acres, mostly grazing land. I run about 50 head of cattle, keep a few horses, some chickens. There's a small orchard your father helped me plant the year after he saved me apples and pears. The house is solid, if simple. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a front room. There's a good well and a creek that runs year-round." "It sounds lovely," Hannah said, surprised by the wistfulness in her own voice. It had been years since she'd lived anywhere that could be described as lovely. "It's home," Henry said simply. "Been working it for 5 years now, ever since I left Texas." "What brought you from Texas to Montana territory?" Henry was quiet for a moment before answering. "War changes a man. After Appomattox, I couldn't go back to what was left of my family's ranch. Too many ghosts. Needed a fresh start." Hannah nodded, understanding. The war had left few lives untouched, even out west. Her own father had lost his eastern business ventures during the conflict, prompting their move to Montana in search of new opportunities. "And your family?" Henry asked. "Just Papa, since Mother died when I was 12. He was all I had." Hannah swallowed hard. "When he caught fever last winter, the doctor tried, but—" "I'm sorry," Henry said softly. "Losing a parent is never easy." They rode in silence for a while after that, each lost in their own memories. The sun climbed higher, and Hannah was grateful for Henry's wide-brimmed hat that provided some shade for both of them. Around midday, just as Henry had predicted, they crested a small rise, and his ranch came into view in the valley below. Hannah caught her breath at the sight. The ranch house sat nestled against a backdrop of pine trees, with a small barn and corral nearby. A stream wound its way through the property, and in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully on the golden grass. "It's beautiful," Hannah murmured. Henry's chest rumbled against her back as he chuckled. "It'll do." As they approached the ranch, a dog came bounding out to meet them, a big, shaggy creature with mismatched ears and an exuberant bark. "That's Scout," Henry explained. "Don't let his size fool you. He's the gentlest soul on 4 legs unless you're threatening his herd." Scout danced around them as Henry guided his horse into the yard and dismounted before helping Hannah down. Her legs felt stiff after the long ride, and she stumbled slightly, grateful for Henry's steadying hand. "Let me show you around," he offered, leading her toward the house. The ranch house was indeed simple but well built and meticulously maintained. The front room held a sturdy table, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, something that surprised Hannah. "You raid?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. Henry smiled faintly. "Whenever I can. Winter nights get long out here." He showed her the kitchen with its cast iron stove and pine cupboards, then led her to what would be her bedroom. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that overlooked the orchard. "It's not much," Henry said, watching her face for a reaction. "It's perfect," Hannah replied honestly. After months of uncertainty following her father's death, the simple room represented security she hadn't dared hope for. "I'll bring your things in," Henry said, then paused. "Though I reckon you didn't have much chance to pack." Hannah shook her head. "The bank took everything when they foreclosed. I was only allowed the clothes on my back. Henry's jaw tightened momentarily. Mrs. Jameson at the general store in town has some ready-made dresses. Next time I go in, we can get you what you need. I can't ask you to, it's not charity, Hannah, Henry interrupted gently. It'll come from your wages. You can't work in just one dress. Hannah nodded, embarrassed but grateful. Thank you. After settling in, Hannah insisted on preparing dinner, though the pantry offerings were sparse beans, salt pork, flour, and coffee made up the bulk of Henry's provisions. Usually I just make do with whatever's simplest, Henry admitted as he watched her work in the kitchen. But I hunt, so there's usually fresh meat, and the garden's been producing well this summer. Hannah glanced out the window at the small vegetable patch. Who tends it while you're working the cattle? I do, Henry said. Early mornings or evenings mostly. It's not much, but it keeps me in fresh vegetables. As they ate the simple meal Hannah had prepared, she found herself studying Henry again. There was a quietness about him that she found comforting after the chaos of recent months. He didn't feel the need to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and direct. I usually rise before dawn, Henry told her as they finished eating. But you needn't keep the same hours. The house is yours to manage as you see fit. I'm an early riser myself, Hannah replied. What duties would you expect of me specifically? Cooking, cleaning, laundry, Henry listed. Tending the garden if you've a mind to. I won't ask you to do anything beyond your strength or skills. Hannah nodded, already planning how she would approach the housekeeping. The place was tidy but could use a woman's attention to detail. That night, alone in her new room, Hannah sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry, not from sadness or fear, but from relief. The auction platform had represented the lowest moment of her life, yet somehow it had led her here, to this quiet ranch, and a man who seemed determined to treat her with dignity despite essentially owning her. Thank you, Papa, she whispered into the darkness, hoping somehow her father could hear her, for saving the man who saved me. The next few weeks established a rhythm to life on Henry's ranch. Hannah rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before Henry headed out to work the cattle. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, and revitalizing the vegetable garden, which had been serviceable under Henry's care but flourished under her more attentive hand. They ate dinner together each evening, their conversations gradually becoming less stilted as they grew accustomed to each other's company. Hannah learned that Henry had fought for the Confederacy, though he spoke of the war reluctantly and without pride. He had been the youngest of 3 brothers, both now dead, one at Shiloh, the other from wounds sustained at Cold Harbor. In turn, Hannah told him about growing up in Boston, her father's shipping business that failed during the war, and their journey west in search of a new beginning. She spoke of her mother's love of art and music, passions she had passed on to Hannah before her untimely death from consumption. I had hoped to become a teacher, Hannah admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Papa arranged for me to apprentice with the schoolmistress in town, but then he fell ill. You still could, Henry said. Calistoga's growing. They might need another teacher soon. Hannah smiled at his encouragement. Perhaps someday. As August turned to September, the first hints of autumn crept into the air. The days remained warm, but the nights grew cooler, and the leaves on the aspen trees began to show hints of gold. Hannah found herself settling into life at the ranch, her initial wariness of Henry giving way to genuine respect, and though she scarcely admitted it to herself, a growing affection. Henry, for his part, seemed to bloom under her presence in his home. He began bringing her small gifts when he returned from checking the far pasture's wildflowers, interesting rocks, once even a sketch pad and charcoals he'd ridden an extra 5 miles to purchase from a traveling peddler. I remembered what you said about drawing, he explained awkwardly when she stared at the gift in surprise. Thought you might like to start again. Hannah had been so touched she'd impulsively kissed his cheek, then immediately blushed scarlet at her own boldness. Henry had cleared his throat, the tips of his ears turning red, before mumbling something about checking on the horses and hastily retreating. That evening, Hannah had drawn her first sketch in over a year, the view from her bedroom window of Henry's orchard with Scout napping beneath one of the apple trees. In late September, Henry announced he needed to ride into Calistoga for supplies. "Would you like to come along?" he asked over breakfast. "Mrs. Jameson should have those dresses ready, and you might enjoy a change of scenery." Hannah hesitated. The thought of returning to the town where she had been sold was unsettling, but the prospect of new clothes and perhaps some books was tempting. Besides, she had been at the ranch for over a month now without leaving its boundaries. "Yes, I think I would," she decided. They set out early the next morning, Hannah riding the gentle mare Henry had been training. The journey to town seemed shorter and pleasanter than Hannah remembered, perhaps because this time she was traveling as a companion rather than cargo. Calistoga had grown even in the short time since Hannah had last seen it. New buildings were going up on the outskirts, and the main street bustled with activity. Hannah felt nervous as they rode into town, acutely aware of curious glances directed their way. Word of her auction had undoubtedly spread, and now here she was, returning on horseback beside the man who had purchased her. "Ignore them," Henry said quietly, noticing her discomfort. "Their opinions matter not a whit." They stopped first at the general store where Mrs. Jameson, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Holt, and this must be Miss Rawlins. I've had those dresses ready for 2 weeks now, wondering when you'd come collect them." She ushered Hannah toward the back of the store where a curtained area served as a fitting room. The dresses were simple but well-made, 2 everyday calicos, one slightly finer dress in a deep blue that Mrs. Jameson insisted brought out Hannah's eyes, and a practical riding skirt and blouse. Hannah changed into the blue dress immediately, feeling more like herself than she had in months. When she emerged, Henry was settling the bill. He turned at her approach, and for a moment he simply stared, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "The blue suits you," he finally said, his voice slightly gruff. Hannah smoothed the skirt self-consciously. "Thank you. And thank you for the clothes." "Remember, it's from your wages," Henry replied, though his expression had softened. "Now, is there anything else you need while we're in town?" Hannah glanced longingly at the shelf of books in the corner of the store. "Go on," Henry encouraged. "Choose a couple. Winter's coming, and you'll want something to read during the long evenings." After selecting 2 novels and a book of poetry, they continued their errands around town, picking up coffee, flour, sugar, and other staples at the mercantile, ordering new horseshoes from the blacksmith, and posting letters at the small post office. As they were loading their purchases onto their horses, a familiar voice called out, "Well, if it isn't the auction bride and her buyer." Hannah tensed, turning to see Bartholomew Jenkins leaning against a hitching post, a sneer on his face. "Afternoon, Jenkins," Henry replied coolly, stepping slightly in front of Hannah. "Surprised to see the girl in town," Jenkins continued, his gaze crawling over Hannah in a way that made her skin crawl. "Thought you'd have her locked away on that ranch of yours. How much would you take for her now?" "I'd still pay a fair price." Henry's hand moved to rest on his revolver. "Miss Rawlins isn't for sale. She works for me of her own free will." Jenkins laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is that what you tell yourself? We all saw you buy her like a prize heifer." Before Henry could respond, Hannah stepped forward, anger replacing her initial fear. "Mr. Holt paid my father's debts and offered me honest employment with fair wages and dignified treatment," she said clearly. "Which is more than I would have received in your establishment, Mr. Jenkins." Jenkins' face darkened. "You've got a sharp tongue for a woman in your position." "And you've got a poor memory for a man who was outbid," Henry replied, his voice dangerously soft. "We'll be on our way now. I suggest you find someone else to bother." They mounted their horses and rode out of town, Hannah's heart still pounding from the confrontation. "I apologize for Jenkins," Henry said once they were on the open road. "He's a snake." "You've nothing to apologize for," Hannah replied. "It was bound to happen. People will talk." "Let them," Henry said firmly. "We know the truth." The truth, Hannah thought, was becoming more complicated by the day. She had come to the ranch as an employee, but somewhere along the way, something had changed. The way Henry looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wouldn't notice, with a mixture of admiration and longing, made her wonder if he felt it too. They rode in companionable silence for a while before Henry asked, "Did you mean what you said to Jenkins about working for me of your own free will?" Hannah considered the question carefully before answering. "Yes," she said finally. "I do have a choice now. I could leave if I wanted to." She glanced at him. "But I don't want to." A small smile curved Henry's lips. "I'm glad to hear it." Back at the ranch, life continued its pleasant routine, but Hannah sensed a subtle shift in their relationship following the trip to town. Henry seemed more attentive, finding reasons to spend time near the house rather than out with the cattle. He built shelves for her books and brought in a comfortable chair for the corner by the fireplace where she liked to read in the evenings. One crisp October morning, Hannah was hanging laundry on the line when the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. A rider was approaching, not Henry, who had gone to check on a break in the fence line, but a stranger. Hannah tensed, remembering Jenkins' hostile attitude in town. As the rider drew closer, she recognized the weathered face of Sheriff Tyson from Calistoga. She set down her laundry basket and wiped her hands on her apron. "Morning, madam," the sheriff called, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "You must be Miss Rawlins. Is Holt around?" "He's checking the north fence line," Hannah replied. "Should be back soon." "Can I offer you some coffee while you wait?" The sheriff accepted gratefully, and Hannah led him into the house, curious about his unexpected visit but wary of asking directly. As she poured coffee, the sheriff glanced around the kitchen approvingly. "Place looks different," he commented. "Homier." "Thank you," Hannah said, setting a mug before him. "May I ask what brings you out this way, Sheriff?" Sheriff Tyson took a long sip of coffee before answering. "Two things, actually. First, wanted to make sure you were being treated right. There was some talk in town after you and Holt ran into Jenkins." Hannah bristled. "Mr. Holt has been nothing but respectful and kind. I'm here by choice, working for fair wages." The sheriff nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good to hear. Never thought otherwise of Holt, but it's my duty to check." He paused. "Second reason is to warn him about some trouble heading this way. Gang of rustlers hit the Peterson place 2 nights ago. Took 20 head of prime cattle and left Peterson's oldest boy with a bullet in his shoulder." Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. "That's terrible. Is he all right?" "Doc thinks he'll pull through," the sheriff replied grimly. "But the rustlers are still out there. They've been working their way through the smaller ranches in the territory. Holt should keep his eyes open." Just then, the door opened and Henry stepped in, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he spotted the sheriff. "Tyson, what brings you out here?" Sheriff Tyson repeated his warning about the rustlers, adding, "They're not just taking cattle. They've been roughing up ranchers, burning barns. Mean bunch." Henry's jaw tightened. "I appreciate the warning. I'll keep watch." After the sheriff departed, Henry immediately began checking his firearms and making plans to move the cattle to the pastures closest to the house. "I don't want you staying here alone," he told Hannah. "If I have to ride out, you come with me." Hannah nodded, touched by his concern. "Do you really think they'll come here?" "Better to be prepared," Henry replied, his expression grim. "I've worked too hard for this place to let anyone take what's mine." The threat of rustlers cast a shadow over the ranch, though days passed without incident. Henry took to sleeping in the front room instead of his bedroom, his rifle close at hand. Hannah found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, and Scout became unusually vigilant, growling at the slightest disturbance. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, Hannah and Henry grew closer. Their evening conversations lengthened, sometimes continuing late into the night as they shared pieces of their lives they had previously kept private. Hannah told him about the fiancé who had broken their engagement when her father lost his fortune. Henry confessed his recurring nightmares about the war. One evening, as the first snow of the season drifted past the windows, Hannah looked up from her book to find Henry watching her, his expression so tender it made her breath catch. "What is it?" she asked softly. Henry hesitated, then said, "I never expected this when I rode into Calistoga that day." "Expected what?" "To feel at peace." Henry set aside the harness he had been mending. "Before you came, this was just a place where I lived. Now it's a home." Hannah felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. "I feel the same way." Something shifted in Henry's eyes, and he moved to kneel beside her chair. "Hannah," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I know how we met wasn't conventional, but these past months, getting to know you." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you." Hannah's heart pounded as she looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there. "Henry." A sudden, frantic barking from Scout interrupted her. Henry was on his feet instantly, grabbing his rifle as he moved to the window. "Someone's coming," he said tersely. "Several riders." Hannah's declaration died on her lips as fear took its place. Henry doused the lamps, leaving only the firelight illuminating the room. "Get behind me," he instructed quietly. "And if anything happens, there's a shotgun under my bed. Use it if you have to." Hannah positioned herself behind him, peering around his shoulder as hoofbeats approached the house. In the moonlight reflected off the snow, she could make out 5 riders pulling up in the yard, their faces obscured by bandanas. "That's gotta be Holt's place," one of them called. "Remember, we want the cattle, but the boss said to make an example of him. No witnesses." Hannah's blood ran cold at the words. Henry's posture stiffened, but he remained steady. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'm going out the back. If shooting starts, get down and stay down." Before Hannah could protest, he slipped away, leaving her alone in the darkened room. She crept to Henry's bedroom, located the shotgun, and returned to the window, her hands trembling as she watched the men dismount. Outside, Scout's barking had stopped abruptly, whether he had retreated or been silenced. Hannah couldn't tell. The men spread out, 2 heading for the barn while the others approached the house. "Holt," one of them shouted. "Come on out and maybe we'll let you live." Hannah's finger hovered near the shotgun's trigger as she watched, heart in her throat. Suddenly, a shot rang out from behind the barn, followed by a cry of pain. The rustlers whirled around, drawing their weapons as Henry's voice called out from the darkness. "Get off my land." "Next shot won't be a warning." Chaos erupted as the rustlers returned fire, shooting blindly into the darkness where Henry's voice had come from. Hannah ducked as bullets splintered the window frame above her head. When she looked up again, the front door was crashing open, and one of the rustlers was storming in. Without thinking, Hannah raised the shotgun and fired. The blast caught the intruder in the shoulder, spinning him backward out the door with a howl of pain. Outside, more gunfire exchanged, and then a scream as one of the rustlers fell from what must have been Henry's shot. "Let's get out of here," someone yelled, and Hannah heard the sound of men scrambling back to their horses. Moments later, silence fell, broken only by the sound of approaching footsteps. Hannah kept the shotgun raised until Henry's voice called out, "Hannah, it's me." She lowered the weapon, trembling with relief as Henry appeared in the doorway, a gash on his forehead but otherwise unharmed. "Are you all right?" they both asked simultaneously. Henry crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, shotgun and all. "You're shaking," he murmured, holding her tightly. "I thought they might have killed you," Hannah whispered against his chest. "Takes more than a few rustlers to do that." Henry drew back to examine her face. "You're really all right," Hannah nodded, then asked anxiously, "Your head just a graze?" Henry touched the wound gingerly. "One of them got lucky, but I got luckier." "What happened to them?" "I winged one, you got another, and I think a third took a bullet when they were firing blindly. They've ridden off, but they might come back with reinforcements." Henry released her reluctantly. "We need to move fast. Pack whatever you can carry. We're riding into town tonight." "Tonight?" "In the snow. It's not falling heavily yet, and there's a full moon. We can make it." Henry was already gathering ammunition and provisions. "I'm not risking your safety by staying here." Within half an hour they had packed essential items and saddled their horses. "Scout," who had thankfully only been hiding during the attack, would accompany them. The snow was falling steadily now, but as Henry had predicted, the full moon provided enough light to see by. As they rode away from the ranch, Hannah glanced back at the house, her home for the past few months, now vulnerable in their absence. "Will it be safe until we return?" "Buildings can be rebuilt," Henry replied grimly. "People can't." They rode through the night, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath their horses' hooves and the occasional snort of breath condensing in the cold air. Despite the danger they had fled, Hannah found herself hyper-aware of Henry's closeness, remembering the words that had been interrupted by the rustler's arrival. He loved her, and she, though she hadn't had the chance to say it, loved him in return. Dawn was breaking when they reached Calistoga, the town still mostly asleep. Henry led them directly to the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Tyson was already at his desk despite the early hour. "Holt, Miss Rollins." He rose quickly at their appearance. "You look like you've been through hell." "Rustlers," Henry explained tersely. "5 of them. They said something about the boss wanting to make an example of me." The sheriff's expression darkened. "You're the 3rd ranch they've hit this week, but the first where anyone fought back effectively." He glanced at Hannah with newfound respect. "Both of you are all right." "Thanks to Hannah's aim with a shotgun," Henry replied, a note of pride in his voice. After giving detailed descriptions of the attackers to the sheriff, who promised to gather a posse to track them, Henry and Hannah took a room at the town's small hotel. The proprietor's wife, Mrs. Fleming, fussed over Hannah, bringing hot water for washing and a clean nightgown she could borrow. Left alone in the room, Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. When Henry returned from seeing to the horses, he hesitated at the door. "I can sleep in the chair," he offered. "Don't be ridiculous," Hannah said softly. "After everything that's happened, I don't want you across the room." Henry's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded and closed the door behind him. As they settled under the blankets, Hannah found herself drawn to his warmth, the events of the night leaving her craving closeness and comfort. "Henry," she whispered in the dim room, "about what you said before the rustlers came." Henry tensed beside her. "I meant it," he said firmly. "But I understand if you don't feel the same way. What happened tonight doesn't change." Hannah silenced him by pressing her fingers gently to his lips. "I love you too," she said simply. "I have for some time now, but I was afraid to admit it, afraid of what it might mean given how we met." Henry took her hand, kissing her fingertips before interlacing their fingers. "How we met doesn't define what we've become to each other," he murmured. "When I saw you on that auction platform, I only knew I had to help you. I never imagined you would help me even more." Hannah nestled closer to him, her head finding the perfect resting place against his shoulder. "When you whispered you after cutting my bonds, what did you mean?" Henry was quiet for a moment before answering. "I meant that I was there for you, not to own you, not to use you, but to help you, to see you as a person when others were seeing property." He stroked her hair gently. "I had no idea then that you would come to mean so much more to me." Hannah lifted her head to meet his gaze in the dim light. "Kiss me," she whispered. Henry needed no further invitation. His lips met hers tenderly at first, then with growing passion as years of loneliness and months of growing affection poured into the kiss. When they finally drew apart, Hannah felt as though something fundamental had shifted, like coming home to a place she had always belonged. They spent 3 days in Calistoga, while Sheriff Tyson and his posse tracked the rustlers. On the 2nd day, word came that they had captured 3 of the gang, including their leader, who turned out to be none other than Bartholomew Jenkins. "Jenkins!" Hannah exclaimed when the sheriff brought them the news. "But he owns the saloon. Why would he need to rustle cattle?" "Greed," Sheriff Tyson replied grimly. "Saloon business has been suffering with the new temperance movement in town, and it seems he took your rejection personally. Holt said you humiliated him at the auction and again in town." Henry's jaw tightened. He tried to buy a human being. He deserved worse than humiliation. On their 3rd evening in town, as they ate dinner in the hotel's small dining room, Henry reached across the table to take Hannah's hand. "I've been thinking," he began, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "When we go back to the ranch, I don't want you to be my housekeeper anymore." Hannah's heart sank momentarily before she caught the look in his eyes. "What would I be then?" she asked carefully. Henry smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his face. "My wife, if you'll have me." Hannah's breath caught. "Are you proposing, Henry Holt?" Inelegantly, but yes. He squeezed her hand. "I love you, Hannah. I want to build a life with you, face whatever comes together. Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Hannah's eyes as joy welled up inside her. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder. "Yes, I will marry you." Several diners turned to look at their table, but Hannah didn't care. In that moment, the journey that had begun on an auction platform in humiliation had led to the happiest moment of her life. They were married 2 days later in the small church in Calistoga, with Sheriff Tyson and Mrs. Fleming as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, but as they exchanged vows, Hannah felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The gold band Henry slipped onto her finger had belonged to his mother, the one family heirloom he had carried with him from Texas. Their return to the ranch was triumphant, though tinged with anxiety about what they might find. To their relief, the property was largely undisturbed. The rustlers had apparently fled directly after the shootout without taking any cattle or causing further damage. As Henry helped Hannah down from her horse, he surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their home. She laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Welcome home, Mrs. Holt," Henry murmured, setting her gently on her feet in the front room. "Home," Hannah repeated, looking around at the simple ranch house that had become so dear to her. "I never thought I'd have one again after Papa died." Henry cupped her face gently. "You'll always have a home with me, no matter where we are." Life settled into a new rhythm after their marriage. Hannah moved her belongings into Henry's now their bedroom, and they fell into the comfortable routine of a married couple. The winter proved harsh, with heavy snowfall isolating the ranch for weeks at a time, but Hannah found the seclusion sweet rather than lonely with Henry by her side. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from Hannah's books or simply talking. Henry proved to be a skilled storyteller once encouraged, recounting tales of his youth in Texas and his adventures driving cattle before settling in Montana. Hannah, in turn, taught him to draw, laughing at his early clumsy attempts, but proud when he produced a recognizable sketch of Scout sleeping by the hearth. Their nights together were a revelation, their passion for each other deepening with each passing day. Hannah, who had once feared what it might mean to belong to a man, discovered the joy of belonging with one instead of equal partnership built on mutual respect and love. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the land, Hannah and Henry began making plans to expand the ranch. The cattle had weathered the winter well, with several new calves born in the early spring. The apple trees in the orchard were heavy with blossoms, promising a bountiful harvest in the fall. "I've been thinking," Henry said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Scout at their feet. "What if we built a proper schoolhouse on the edge of our property? The Petersons have 5 children, the Wilsons have 3, and more families are settling in the valley every month." Hannah looked at him in surprise. "A schoolhouse? You said you wanted to teach," Henry reminded her. "This way you could fulfill that dream without having to leave the ranch." Hannah's heart swelled with love for this man who remembered her dreams and wanted to help her achieve them. "That would be wonderful," she said softly, "but it would be a significant undertaking." "We could start small," Henry suggested. "I've been saving to buy more land, but this seems more important." He hesitated. "Especially considering we might need a school closer to home in a few years." Hannah's breath caught as she understood his meaning. "Henry, are you saying?" He smiled, reaching out to place his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "You've been tired lately, and you couldn't stomach coffee yesterday morning. My mother had 4 children. I recognized the signs." Tears filled Hannah's eyes as she covered his hand with her own. "I wasn't sure." It's early still. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain. Henry gathered her into his arms, his voice thick with emotion. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." As Hannah returned his embrace, she marveled at how life could change so dramatically in less than a year. From the desperate young woman standing on an auction platform to a beloved wife expecting her first child, it seemed almost miraculous. "I still can't believe how far we've come," she murmured against Henry's shoulder. "I can," Henry replied, stroking her hair. "From the moment I saw you, I knew you were special, Hannah. Even then, I think some part of me recognized what we could be to each other." The schoolhouse project began in earnest as summer approached. Word spread throughout the valley, and neighboring ranchers volunteered labor and materials, eager for their children to have educational opportunities closer than Calistoga. Hannah found herself at the center of the community, planning the curriculum and furnishings while her pregnancy progressed. By late summer, the small schoolhouse stood completed at the crossroads where Henry's property met the main trail, a simple but sturdy building with large windows to let in light, a pot-bellied stove for winter heating, and desks crafted by the local carpenter. Hannah hung a bell over the door, and Henry surprised her with a proper blackboard ordered all the way from Denver. The school opened in September with 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Hannah found teaching even more rewarding than she had imagined, especially with Henry's unwavering support. He often brought her lunch during the school day or stopped by to help with repairs and maintenance. As Hannah's pregnancy advanced, one of the older girls, Betsy Peterson, began assisting with the younger children, showing a natural aptitude for teaching that Hannah encouraged. By the time winter snow made travel difficult again, arrangements had been made for Betsy to take over classes temporarily after the baby arrived. On a cold January night in 1878, with snow piling against the windows and the wind howling across the valley, Hannah gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, with the midwife from a neighboring ranch barely making it through the snowdrifts in time. But when Henry finally held his son in his arms, his face shining with tears and wonder, Hannah knew every moment of pain had been worthwhile. "He's perfect," Henry whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny fingers. "What shall we name him?" Hannah smiled tiredly. "I was thinking Robert, after my father, Robert Henry Holt." Henry's eyes softened at the mention of the man who had inadvertently brought them together. "Robert Henry it is," he agreed, carefully placing the swaddled infant in Hannah's arms. "Your grandfather saved my life, little one," he told the baby solemnly. "And in doing so, he gave me the greatest gift I could have imagined, your mother." As Hannah looked down at her son's tiny face, then up at her husband's beloved features, she felt a completeness she had never known was possible. From the darkest moment of her life, standing bound and humiliated on an auction platform, had come this beautiful family and home. "I love you," she whispered to Henry. "Both of you so very much." Henry bent to kiss her forehead, then their son's, his eyes reflecting all the love in his heart. "And I love you, Mrs. Holt, always." Spring brought new beginnings as Hannah resumed teaching, often with baby Robert in a cradle beside her desk. The school had grown to 20 students, with families moving to the area specifically because of the educational opportunity. Henry's cattle business thrived, allowing them to purchase additional acreage and expand their operations. By summer, plans were underway for a proper town to develop around the crossroads near the school, with talk of a general store, a church, and eventually, perhaps, even a doctor's office. Henry was instrumental in the planning, donating land and helping to survey the lots. "What do you think of the name Holtsville?" Sheriff Tyson suggested during one planning meeting at their ranch house. Henry shook his head. "This valley belongs to all of us who have worked to build something here, not just me." "How about Providence?" Hannah suggested, "because it seems providential that we've all found our way here." The name was unanimously approved, and by the following spring, the small settlement of Providence, Montana Territory, had begun to take shape. Hannah watched its growth with pride, knowing she and Henry had played a crucial role in its founding. As their son grew from infant to toddler, bringing daily joy and chaos into their lives, Hannah often reflected on the extraordinary journey that had led her to this happiness. The auction that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, the first step on a path to love and fulfillment she could never have imagined. 5 years after that fateful day in Calistoga, Hannah stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Henry teaching 5-year-old Robert to ride his new pony. Their 3-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, clung to Hannah's skirts, begging to be next. Hannah's hand rested on her growing belly, where their third child stirred restlessly. The ranch had prospered beyond their early hopes, now employing several hands and running over 200 head of cattle. The schoolhouse had grown into a proper school with Hannah as headmistress and 2 additional teachers. Providence had become a thriving community with a church, store, and doctor's office, just as planned. As she watched her family, Hannah's mind drifted back to that summer day when she had stood trembling on an auction platform. She remembered the despair, the humiliation, the certainty that her life was over. And then Henry had appeared, cutting her bonds and whispering that single word, "you," that had changed everything. Henry looked up at that moment, as if sensing her thoughts, and smiled the same smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. He lifted Robert onto the pony's back and, after making sure the boy was secure, crossed the yard to join Hannah on the porch. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Holt," he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. Hannah leaned into his embrace, watching their son's delighted face as the pony took a few careful steps under the watchful eye of one of the ranch hands. "I was just thinking about how fortunate we are," she replied. "How one moment can change the course of a life." Henry followed her gaze to their children, then looked down at her growing belly. "Best $300 I ever spent," he said with a grin. Hannah laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "Is that all I was worth to you?" Henry's expression grew serious as he turned to face her fully, his hands gently framing her face. "You, Hannah Holt, are worth everything. My heart, my life, my soul. And I thank God every day that I was in Calistoga that afternoon." As their lips met in a tender kiss, Hannah silently echoed his gratitude. From an auction block to this beautiful life, it was a journey beyond anything she could have dreamed, with the promise of many more years of love and adventure still to come. "Mama, Papa, look at me," Robert called, his face shining with accomplishment as he guided his pony in a small circle. Breaking their kiss with a smile, Henry and Hannah turned to watch their son, their hands intertwined and hearts full. The past had brought them together, but it was the future bright with promise and filled with love that stretched endlessly before them.